Lies of P released in 2023. It's a game that falls into the category of a Souls-like game, a genre which takes aspects from and is inspired by From Software's amazing Dark Souls-born Kiro Ring games. Many of you have probably already heard of these games before. However, if not, they're all well known for being very challenging games, with a focus on level design and combat, with most areas concluding with a difficult boss fight. The difficulty does not come from how hard they hit or being a damage sponge, more from them having attacks that the player needs to read and understand and act accordingly in order to either avoid damage or strategically tank damage to then counter. These fights are often referred to as challenging but fair. Since From Software's titles, there has been a plethora of games looking to reach the same audience, with some titles being really well made and others not. However, it's safe to say that no other game in the Souls-like genre were on par with From Software's originals. That was until Lies of P. As mentioned, Lies of P came out in 2023. It was developed by NeoWiz and Round 8 Studios. They hadn't touched the Souls-like genre before Lies of P, and yet it's been crafted so beautifully and comes together so well, it makes you wonder if they had people from FromSoft working on the game, as this title is truly on par with them. Before I get into the meat and bones of this critique, I want it to be known that I am basing this off my most recent playthrough, which is version 1.5.0.0. I played the game when it launched 3 times back to back and then once more recently for this video. And since launching, the game has undergone some major changes made to it. And so, to stay fair, since my critique is coming a lot later than the game's release, I'll be breaking it down in its current state. However, I will mention and make comparisons to the previous versions. Although this game is a Souls-like, and I have already mentioned FromSoft's games multiple times now, I just want to express that this game is unique. It is its own game. However, I will draw from other titles to say how and what works well, and what needs work and improving on. With that being said, this is your spoiler warning. Click off now if you wish to play this game, as I will be showing and talking about story beats, areas and bosses. The game takes inspiration from the fairy tale of Pinocchio, written by Carlo Collodi, and it references the tale throughout. It takes the idea of puppets, lies and the ideology of an artificial being becoming human, much like how Pinocchio in the fairy tale wishes to become a real boy. The game opens up with our character, P, who is never actually named, only referred to as Geppetto's puppet. If the title is anything to go off about our character, then he may be named after the source material, Pinocchio, but I will refer to him as P throughout. P is awoken by a woman's voice, as well as the touch of what seems like an ethereal butterfly. He is told to go to Hotel Krat. P awakens into a dystopian city known as Krat. It is in a state of horror when P is restored and the player sees this world for the first time. This is all due to the event known as the Krat disaster, which breaks down into 2 parts. The first is the puppet frenzy. In this society, a powerful form of energy was discovered called Ergo. It was used to power inventions made by great technicians and engineers, and one man named Giuseppe Geppetto created the puppets and powered them with this Ergo. The puppets had a set of laws imprinted into them as a way to control them, and to essentially have them on puppet strings. These laws are named the Grand Covenant. The Grand Covenant's laws are: all puppets must obey their creator's commands. A puppet may not harm a human. A puppet must protect and serve humans and the city of Krat. A puppet cannot lie. At some point, these laws were no longer enough to bind the puppets, and they began to show signs of human-like intelligence, awareness, and began to think for themselves, as well as essentially doing anything they wanted to. The act of a puppet changing into this state is known as the puppet's ego awakening. The second half of the disaster is due to the epidemic known as the petrification disease. The disease was discovered by a group known as the Alchemists when they recovered an ancient relic known as the Arm of God. They would begin running experiments with it, and due to their greed for knowledge, the disease would be created and ultimately spread. This caused the citizens of Krat to begin shutting down. Organ failure would occur, their body began to harden into scales, and their mind would become corrupted, and they would start to show signs of insanity. There's no such treatment for it. As a result, whoever caught it eventually died, a slow, painful death, becoming petrified. There's more to the story, however, for now, I will give this context and elaborate further on the story as we go along. Talking about the story, it's a lot more in your face and obvious than that of a typical Souls game. There are still mentions of the history, characters, and more lore within collectibles such as the documents or notes, as well as in weapon descriptions and outfits. But this game takes a more head-on approach with the story, and so by the end most players should have an understanding of what they've just played through, which I found as a breath of fresh air from a typical Souls game. It had me more invested in the story and lore, and therefore found myself often looking at collectibles and item descriptions to find and piece together things myself rather than going and having to watch a YouTube video on the story. This was a warm welcome to the genre for me. As well as the clear story beats, the game had a lot of cutscenes and NPCs that further detail the backstory of the city we're fighting through, as well as events and people that we meet throughout, and we find their individual stories as well. Everyone in the game seems to be there for a reason. They aren't just put in there for filler. In my opinion, there's probably only 2 NPCs I can think of that are a little lackluster. However, they still have some kind of story to be told and play into the larger picture that Lies of P is painting. However, I'm getting sidetracked, so let's go back to where it begins. After P is revived, he finds his sidekick for the game, Gemini. He acts as an on-the-go reminder and info bot, giving details about areas and characters so that the player understands where they are, their goals and who they've came across. He speaks a lot when it seems unnecessary, however is quiet in moments where it feels like he should have a lot to say. But overall, I liked his quirkiness, and he was a helpful reminder during some quests. I think his voice actor did a great job, and I overall enjoyed Gemini, which seems to be your hot take. At the end of the train cart, P is given a choice of weapons which also gives the player their starting stats. Lies of P has the usual stat building of a Souls game, allowing the player to make a build around their own playstyle. The stats we have in the game are Vitality, which increases the player's health, Vigour, which is stamina, Capacity, which increases the amount of weight P can hold. The higher the load, the more stamina is consumed upon actions. It's worth saying now that outfits do not count as weight in the game. As well as that, Capacity also benefits the Legion arm, giving it more power and usage before it needs refilled. Motivity, which is essentially strength and allows the player to wield heavier, harder hitting weapons more easily. Technique gives the player a more dexterity focused build, allowing the use of quicker, more agile weapons. And finally, Advance, which increases the player's elemental damage output as well as upping P's resistances to ailments. The 3 classes that are presented are the Path of the Cricket for a balanced stat loadout, Path of the Bastard for dexterity focused builds, and a Path of the Sweeper for a strength build. It doesn't matter too much which one you pick, as if you don't like the weapon you have, you get the option to buy the other 2 at the end of the first area from a merchant before the first boss. I played with the Rapier from the dexterity build since my previous playthroughs were strength focused. I would say any build is fine to go with, and even the stats don't matter too much as it doesn't require a lot of ergo, this game's equivalent of Souls, to change your build early on. After selecting your weapon, you leave the train cart and encounter the first puppets, which move as you would intend a mechanical enemy to do so. They attack with stutter and stiffness in their swings, challenging the player and teaching them very early on that panic rolling or trying to parry without paying attention is not going to pay off. After the first few enemies, we find the healing item of this game, Pulse Cells. Pulse Cells give the player a set amount of uses before running out, starting with just 3 and having to be refilled at a checkpoint in order to refill them. However, when they're depleted, P can earn a Pulse Cell back if the player continues to do damage to enemies. This can help getting your health back to full after a tricky situation, or during a boss fight it can give you the upper edge if you can manage to avoid damage and continue to do damage, allowing you to clutch and win a fight. Combat in Lies of P includes a mix of different styles that I think are blended together really well, especially more so after the patches and updates. However, there's still some cons to the combat that I would like to cover. Lies of P's combat is clearly inspired by multiple different mechanics from the Souls games. P can do light attacks, heavy attacks and Fable Arts, which are weapon specific attacks that the player can only perform once they have earned enough Fable on their meter, which you gain from attacking and killing enemies. P also has a Legion arm, which has its similarities to the Sekiro Shinobi prosthetic. The player can unlock different arms that perform differently, some acting as a flamethrower, some allowing P to plant defensive mines, and one that turns all players into an anime character that feels amazing when executed correctly. The Legion arms have a set amount of uses which can be increased with the capacity stat, and refilled without the use of a checkpoint with an item called a Legion magazine. Those are most ways that P deals damage. Now to avoid damage, P is given an array of different methods for the player's choosing, which at first seems almost too much, as if the developers weren't sure of what approach they wanted to take to combat. However, after a few hours of playing, and especially after the first few bosses, I came to the conclusion that you are supposed to use all of them. By all of them, I mean dodging, blocking and parrying. To take it away from Lies of P for a minute, Dark Souls focuses on rolling and countering as its offense and defense, a slower paced combat style that rewards the player for leaning into a build, either being nimble and dodging, attacking when an opening is presented, or tanking attacks and punishing afterwards to deal a lot of damage. Bloodborne approaches combat much differently, with focus of a quicker, more aggressive combat style, paired with a rallying mechanic that again rewards aggressive playstyles. Sekiro is unlike any other FromSoft game, with dodging being the last thing the player wants to do. The focus is on parrying and building a stagger meter up until they can perform a death blow. Lies of P takes all three of these and mashes it together. It shouldn't work since the slow pacing of Dark Souls and faster pacing of Bloodborne and Sekiro should clash. However, NeoWiz blended it together and seasoned it with their own mechanics and served something that I believe no one could have expected. For dodging, P has iframes and can do a dash or a roll to avoid attacks. Dodging should be used when the player is unsure of an attack to telegraph the timing or simply to create space. That is what I used it for in my playthroughs. If I couldn't get a parry off consistently, I would substitute that out for a roll to play it safe instead. P can block and tank damage, however each attack block costs stamina, and if an enemy causes P to run out of stamina, his guard will fall and he will be vulnerable for a couple seconds, allowing him to take a lot of damage. Blocking should be used when the player does not have time to respond to an attack. It can be used when failing a parry or a perfect block as this game calls it, acting as a safety net and reducing the amount of damage the player would take if they try to parry and let go of the button too early. If they hold the parry/block button, they will then at least reduce the amount of damage taken. For parrying, P can perform what's called a perfect guard by blocking just before a hit lands. This negates all damage and builds up the enemy's invisible stagger bar, which if performed enough times will cause them to stagger, leaving them open for a strong attack. When an enemy or a boss's stagger has been built up enough, they don't immediately become vulnerable. Instead, a white bar surrounds their health bar, and if P performs a heavy attack, it will then stagger them and he can perform a fatal attack, which deals a lot of damage, as well as aiding in refilling the pulse cell if empty. The combination of dodging, parrying and blocking all complement each other, and each have their own benefits in combat. As for staggering a boss, parries aren't the only way to do it. Consistent attacking, heavy attacks, fable arts and using the Legion arm all aid in such. But, as well as helping in staggering an enemy, parrying also has other uses such as the ability to break an enemy's weapon, which happens when the player has performed enough perfect blocks. This reduces the amount of damage that enemy deals and can be a deciding factor on a win or a loss in a fight. And yes, this also goes for bosses, not all but the ones using a physical weapon. The rallying mechanic has been mentioned a couple of times, but I haven't mentioned how it works yet. Rallying can only occur after P has blocked an attack. If he takes damage without blocking, he will lose a chunk of health that can only be recovered using a pulse cell. If he blocks, he loses a chunk that can be recovered if the player counters the enemy quick enough. So overall, dodging and blocking can be a safer way to approach combat until the player feels comfortable with the moveset and telegraphs of a boss or an enemy, and at that point they can then begin trying to perfect parry attacks for that high risk, high reward style of combat. However, it isn't always completely necessary to accomplish combat. My first con is to do with perfect guarding however. Most of the time it is high risk, high reward. However, in some situations it's better described as high risk, medium reward, and it all comes down to the mechanic of weapon durability. As mentioned before, parrying causes the enemy's weapon to break if performed enough times. However, it isn't one way, as P's weapon also has a durability meter that decreases the longer he fights without using his grindstone to sharpen his weapon. The weapon's durability depletes from attacking and blocking, which makes sense. The player then has to sharpen it to avoid breaking, since if it does, it won't do anywhere near as much damage as it should. Unfortunately, parrying causes the durability to deplete, which I just don't like, since some bosses are relentless with their combos, and it seems like parrying should be the best option if the player is able to perform them consistently. An example of this would be Lexacia, an endgame boss who has some really long quick attacking combos. One of her combos starts with her slamming her sword fairly slow, yet she speeds up and attacks whilst also moving towards the player. So dodging isn't an option since you would avoid one attack but you'll get hit by the next one most likely. Blocking isn't an option since your stamina will most likely break and therefore you'll be open for damage. So that leaves you with two options, run or parry. Every time I did Lexacia, I managed to get the timing of the attacks down so I could parry the majority of the attacks in that combo. However, afterwards I wasn't able to punish since that combo and combos before it would have brought my weapon's durability down so low that they would need to be repaired. Therefore she attacks me, I can't punish, and rinse and repeat. dragging the fight out much longer than what it feels like it should have been, compared to other bosses. There are items that can repair your weapons much quicker than using your grindstone, and it's effective. However, I think for how small the parry window is and how relentless some bosses can be, I think it would have been better off with the parry either negating the effect of weapon durability or reducing it so it takes less durability off with each perfect guard. I understand that if they removed it completely when parrying, then the mechanic may as well be removed from the game, since it's not something that builds up a lot over time, and is normally only reduced a lot when not managed well between fights. This may just be an issue that I ran into, and I can't say it's a huge issue since there are ways to manage it better in combat, such as using the item to recover it quicker. With that said, the mechanics of combat are mostly covered. Overall, the feel of it is great. It's fast paced but can be slowed down if the player needs it. It's rewarding to land perfect guards, but just as rewarding to successfully dodge an attack and counter. After the train station, the world opens up a little and shows the city in which the player will be fighting in. Crap. It opens with a defaced statue of a man who was obviously a large part in this city's history. In fact, it's the alchemist who discovered Ergo and began working to build the city as we see it in game. His name is Valentinus Monad. From the very moment P wakes up to the last section of the game, things are placed all around the city and other areas that really help with the world building, and if the player takes the time to look at these things, they will discover more about the story and the world they're in. This statue is one of those things. However, there's more subtle details in the world that I love, such as the first boss of the game being on posters around the first area, including the train where P wakes up. As well as this, there are very jarring comparisons within levels that show what the citizens of the city thought would be a revelation that turned to be a nightmare. In the train station, you can find posters that state Ergo is life, and others that describe the puppets as the best servants around. These build upon the narrative that the city truly believed it had something incredible, even referring to the Ergo's life itself. As the player finally comes out into the city, they come across the first Stargazer. These act as checkpoints, and the player can use them to fast travel between places, refill pulse cells, and adjust their gear if they wish to do so. The first area is one of my favourites, as it sets up a creepy tone for the game, and the enemies within do a good job at teaching the player how to utilise their loadouts and how to approach combat, but this is a Souls-like game, and that means bosses. The first boss is the Parade Master. He is a great first boss in my opinion. His attacks are still jarring like other puppets, playing into the idea that this boss we are fighting is made of metal and is moving mechanically. His attacks are fairly slow, so it gives the player plenty of time to read them, and he doesn't do many attacks. He has some slams and some swings, with one of his attacks being a slam into the ground. What I didn't mention in combat is that some attacks glow red. These are called fury attacks. They cannot be dodged. The player is expected to perfect guard these attacks, otherwise they take massive damage. The player can actually run away or dodge depending on the attack, but you can't expect to use iframes from dodges to escape it. Instead, you must just get out of range. One of the things I love about this boss as a tutorial is that his fury attack in the first phase is the slam, so the player has already been shown this move. It's not a parry specific attack, giving the player the experience before they're expected to perfect guard. Halfway through the fight, the boss decides his head will make for a great weapon and decides to rip it off, as you do. He becomes a bit more aggressive and utilises his puppet body to his advantage, rotating his torso all the way around and attacking from the right when it looks like he would attack from the left. He has a new fury attack, but it's just a swipe. All in all, his combos are well telegraphed. He's a good example of how to perfect guard, and he is a very cool looking boss. Before the fight, there is a merchant and a training dummy. This merchant sells P weapons and items such as an electric blitz, an item that imbues your weapon with electricity. This item is first found here, right before the boss. It's hinting to the player that using electricity might be a good idea, and it is because the puppet enemies are weaker to electricity. I love when games hint at things that could be effective without holding the player's hand, and Lies of P does this many times. Some of them might just be me thinking too much into it, but for example, one of the first weapons you can buy that isn't a starting weapon is the electric coil stick. This drastically improves the amount of damage the player does to puppets. Now of course, if the player buys it and uses it, they will notice the difference, but if they read the item description, it states, the head of a blunt weapon made by the Vanini company to destroy puppets. The coil releases a powerful current that causes lethal damage to puppets. Another example would be at the cathedral, where another enemy type is the focus of the area, the carcasses. At a point in the level, the player drops a brazier fire into what looks like a type of acid. This same pool of substance is home to some carcasses and they don't take damage in this, implying that they're made of it or at least contain it in their body. The fire completely removes the pool and so teaches the player that fire is a weakness of theirs. Back to Krat, and P can head to the hotel now, which acts as the hub area. Before entering, he is told that he must lie in order to get past the hotel security since only humans can enter. At the main doors, the player is presented with the option to lie or tell the truth. To progress, they must lie. This is the first of many choices the player will make throughout the game, and there are 3 endings tied to these choices. Within the hotel, P meets the woman who gave him life, Sophia. She is who the player goes to in order to level up. As well as her, there are other NPCs that fill space, including Eugenie, who upgrades weapons, a receptionist who can sell items, and Antonia, who is a story NPC. More NPCs return to the hotel throughout the game. You can level up, improve weapons, and as well as that, there is a garden where you can test out your new weapons and see if you like the moveset or the damage, rather than having to leave the area, fight some enemies and then come back and repeat. The hotel also houses an area where P can upgrade and buy new Legion arms, yet it isn't until we have saved Vanini until we can make full use of that area. However, the player is rewarded with a new Legion arm from Eugenie for defeating the Parade Master. Something worth a mention here is that you can actually see when you're able to level up. The ergo counter will become blue rather than white when the player has enough ergo to level up. This is a really nice quality of life feature that saves you travelling to level up just to find out you don't have enough ergo. The game is linear in its story. The player must follow a certain path and is told where to go. You can backtrack and go to previous areas, however, don't expect to be given a choice of paths to take. With that being said, the next area is Elysian Boulevard to save Geppetto. Elysian Boulevard has 2 layers to it, the rooftops and the streets. The rooftops is home to some annoying new enemies, some throw electric blitzes at you, and another, much more annoying enemy, which I'm pretty sure is meant to be a chimney sweeper, will charge at you with a spear type weapon that will stab and stab repeatedly, rendering you useless, unless you dodge out of the way or spam parry and break their weapon. The rooftops are also where the player first comes across a moonlight butterfly. These only appear when you're close enough to them and only have a limited amount of time to kill them before it disappears. Upon killing it, it normally drops an upgrade material or a crank. The upgrade materials are pretty self-explanatory and allows you to increase your weapon's potency, increasing its attack value, and cranks are used to change your weapon's scaling properties. For example, a weapon such as the electric coil stick has an advanced stat of B, meaning if the player levels advanced, the weapon scales better than if they were to level into technique. However, applying a technique crank to the weapon will change it to scale better with that, and some weapons can be further improved with the crank, so applying an advanced crank to the electric coil stick will take its advanced scaling from a B to an A. I did run into an issue where I tried applying a technique crank to the Puppet Ripper weapon to rank it up to an S scale, however it wouldn't scale any further than an A, and yet another weapon called Etiquette I could scale up to an S tier in technique. Both weapons were from bosses. I'm not sure why, but it seems that you can't scale all weapons to an S tier, despite some allowing it. Some only go as far as A, even if you're scaling the stat that is the highest on that weapon. If you're changing a weapon's main stat, I don't believe you can get it up to S, and that makes sense. It doesn't ever explain why certain weapons can't scale as high as others, and yet is something that a player will just need to experiment with to learn. Weapons being limited just seems off, like it wasn't intentional since there's no real explanation for it. If there is, I've missed it, and I would love to know. Back in Elysian Boulevard now, and to get between the rooftops and the streets, there are plenty of shortcuts to unlock and transition between the layers. This game does not fall short on shortcuts, with some being put in some questionable places, but I'll point some of the worst ones out when it comes to them in the story. There's ladders and elevators that allow P to move between Elysian Boulevard, and they're all activated by hitting a switch from one end, but first the player must take the long way around to find the switch. Pretty standard. The boulevard has a couple of mini bosses including a police puppet and what I'm assuming was a factory puppet used to move stuff based on the montage we got at the start. These mini bosses are also plentiful around Krat, with some being harder than actual bosses and will kick your ass more times than you or I would like to admit. Fortunately though, the ones in this area aren't too bad and can be disposed of pretty quick. In this level, we encounter our first NPCs who have quests tied to them. The first is a kid named Toma, and the second is an older woman who is mourning over her child that was taken away from her. These two quests are fairly straightforward and yet are different in how they teach the player how quests work. I'll start with the Weeping Woman. We find her in the quarantine zone and she asks P to find her baby. The player will most likely find it since it's on the beaten path to the next boss, and just off to the side is a puppet beating a body of a human. After doing to the puppet what it just did to that body, the player will find an item, a baby doll. Gemini pipes up and reminds the player of the quest and advises we take it back to the Weeping Woman. If the player forgets what they need to do with the item or who or where they need to take it to, they can find out when at a Stargazer, as the NPC's head will be shown in the area where they are, reminding the player of where to go. Again, this is a great quality of life system that I just love. I was never a fan of games expecting the player to remember all the NPCs and individual quests, since if the player ever took a break or just forgot about a quest, there was no way of remembering other than looking at a guide. Lies of P solves that issue. Upon returning the doll to the woman, a decision must be made by the player, to lie or tell the truth. In the game, lying is seen as the good option mostly. Lying improves P's humanity, since lying is seen as a more human thing to do, as sometimes it's better to tell a white lie than the truth, as seen with this NPC. Lying tells her her baby is cute, telling the truth tells her it's not real, it's a doll, and she's insane. The second NPC quest is Tummer. He mentions a friend of his called Murphy, and wants to hear him again and play alongside him. Murphy is the nickname given to the next boss by the kids. The player knows him as the Scrapped Watchman. After the fight, a whistle can be found on a bench. There are no cues to take it back to Tummer this time, other than looking at a Stargazer. Taking it back and speaking does not complete this quest. Instead, you have to interact with it from within the items tab. This makes P play the whistle and complete the quest. This shows the player that sometimes you have to do something else with a quest item rather than just handing it over to the NPC. However, there are very few examples of this type other than Tummer. I do have some gripes with the NPC quests and with the choices the player can make. When it comes down to lying or telling the truth, it plays a large part in which ending you receive, and lying to an NPC aids in that. However, your decisions within the individual quests do not matter as much as what they should. Telling the truth or lying normally results in the same outcome, with a change in dialogue. For example, the Weeping Woman's dialogue changes, however you still get rewarded, you just don't get a record. More major side quests like that of Antonia's, who has the petrification disease, and with the help of Polendina, the receptionist, and another NPC called Giangio, you can make a cure. Now there's a choice, either give her the cure and shorten her lifespan but be cured of the disease, or don't give her the cure and let her live, slowly dying due to the disease. Either way, Antonia dies. Polendina resets himself back to a normal puppet without an ego. The only difference is a change in dialogue. This is the death of a major NPC, not a Weeping Woman level NPC. P speaks and interacts with Antonia all the time should the player let him, and yet the game convinces the player there's a choice with her life, freeing her from pain or being selfish and letting her live through it, and yet the choice is all an illusion since it doesn't actually matter. A quest where the choice does matter is Belle's. She asks P to find her military partner Atkinson, and when the player does, he is on the verge of turning into a monster. He gives a letter to P and asks him to tell Belle that he died a soldier, rather than becoming mutated into a carcass. Doing just that and telling a lie to Belle has her accept it as the truth and stays in the hotel for her own safety, and awaits for everything to blow over in the hope that one day she can find his family and tell them what actually happened to him. If the player tells the truth and says he became a monster, she decides to leave and try and escape Krat so she doesn't become like him. She tries to escape through Krat Central Station and comes across him, where he is then turned into the monster and he kills her. This choice had an impact, it changed the outcome of the character's life, but unfortunately there's more of the former than the latter. An NPC quest just seemed like a way for the ending to change, rather than being a unique story to them. On a bridge, the player comes across the first human enemy, the Mad Donkey, who is a stalker. He's trying to get to Geppetto, who has locked himself in a police car. The Mad Donkey is a very hard-hitting boss. His attacks are a little more predictive considering his shoulders aren't made of cogs, meaning the player may find it easier fighting stalkers than other bosses, yet they're no easy feat. He isn't a boss that paces around between attacks. Instead, he's always running towards the player and closing the gap. Being relentless here is the way to go. I found him harder than the parade boss when I played even on my 4th playthrough. Once beaten, Geppetto orders P to take out the Scrapped Watchman within the city central, so P heads there next. The player is also rewarded with the Enigma assembly tool. They get to use this at the following Stargazer. The item allows the player to split a weapon into its separate parts, a handle and a blade, which can then be combined to make a new, more unique weapon. This is a great system that NeoWiz have implemented. Not only does it play into the world and the story that follows, but gameplay wise, it also makes the player more interested in swapping out weapons rather than picking one and running with it throughout the whole game. The stat the weapon scales with is decided on the handle, not the blade. You can take a dagger's handle and put a hammer on the end of it and wield it like a goofy Looney Tunes weapon. The moveset is determined by the handle, however the Fable art carries over from both the handle and the blade, allowing for some really fun or straight up broken builds. The only weapons that can't be dismantled and rebuilt are the boss weapons, which are one item, not a blade and a handle that can separate. However, there is still 2 Fable art attached to each boss weapon. Following the encounter with the Mad Donkey is the next mainline boss, the Scrapped Watchman. The Watchman is a very fun fight, albeit difficult, since the intensity is ramped up tenfold compared to the Parade Master. This boss once again has well telegraphed attacks except for one, which is a grab, since this grab motion looks almost the same as the swing attack telegraph. Therefore I would attempt to parry or iframe dodge through it and it would result in me being grabbed and pummeled despite the fact it's not a fury attack. My first playthroughs of the game had me stuck on this boss for a while. His combos were difficult and the timing I just couldn't get down. Eventually, with enough practice, I made it past the boss, and looking back on it, it falls into the category of difficult but fair, but the grab attack does lose a few points for me. Halfway through the fight, his overcharged battery begins exploding. Releasing electricity, he becomes more aggressive and has some new moves, including a jump in the air which turns into a dive into your face if you don't move or parry in time. His attacks in the second phase tend to have a delayed burst of electricity after them, meaning the player cannot counter straight after an attack, and has to be more strategic with placing their shots as well as their positioning. Comparing him to the Parade Master, it's clear the intention was to teach the player not to panic roll or parry, since that will only result in death. If the player can calm their nerves and take the time to look at his arm raising and looking for small details, they will learn his patterns quickly. An example of this would be his combo of 2 slams followed by a fury attack slam. When he raises his arm and starts swinging it, he will drop the other arm to the floor just before attacking, which gives the player the perfect opportunity to parry or dodge. For his fury attack, he stops swinging his arms just before executing the move, and he also drops his knee. However, this is very tight, so I would often just look for when his arms stop spinning. He can be overwhelming at times, especially in the second phase, and I think he maybe has a touch too much health, as in the second phase he can really start overstaying his welcome, as you have to rethink your position after every attack in order to avoid the electricity, meaning you have less time to attack yourself and spend more time moving and dodging or parrying. But if the player cannot get the parry timing down, then this boss fight becomes even longer with the failure of breaking his posture. All in all though, a good fun fight, and if you're struggling too much you can always summon a Spectre. Spectres can be summoned before a boss fight to aid in the combat and take a lot of aggro away from the player, whilst also dealing a fair bit of damage themselves. They can be summoned using an item called a Star Fragment, which there are plenty of around the world. I don't tend to use summon in these games since I love the feeling of learning and overcoming a challenging boss, and by the end of my first playthrough I was overflowing with Star Fragments. On subsequent playthroughs I did use summons in the more tedious fights, and even then I still had plenty left by the end of the game. Upon killing the Watchman, he drops a couple of useful items, including one which gives the player a new electricity firing Legion arm, and another, more important item which unlocks the P organ, which is an upgrade system. Returning to Geppetto's office in the hotel is where P can be upgraded. These upgrades are in phases, and the next one is only unlocked after buying enough upgrades in the current phase. Each phase has 4 upgrades, including things such as an increase in pull cells, Fable art meters, faster use of items, extra slots on your belt, and more. However, to unlock the upgrades there are a number of slots that need to be filled in first with minor upgrades. These are bought with quartz, which can be found in the world, dropped from mini bosses and bought from vendors. Minor upgrades are split into categories of attack, survival, ability and item type. The attack and survival type increases things such as the amount of stagger damage dealt and how much energy is charged from the pulse cells upon hits. The ability type has a focus on the Legion arm and Fable arts, and the item type focuses on how many consumables and throwables you can carry. Some of the main upgrades stand out more than others, including the Link dodge, which allows the player to dodge during a dodge, rather than having a short cooldown between them. This is fortunately in the first phase and can be unlocked fairly early on. This brings me to one of the first comparisons I'm going to make between the current version of the game and the old. When the game first released, one of the things locked behind an upgrade was the ability to jump up when knocked down. In most Soulslikes, if your character falls over you can dodge and get up quickly. This was not possible in Lies of P on release, and made for very unfair deaths. Some enemies, you know what I'm talking about if you've played, will knock you down and beat you like you owe it money. and the player would just have to hope that they don't die. But there was nothing you could do to counter it until unlocking the upgrade. Now, fortunately, the devs are great and listened to the feedback of players and removed this as an upgrade and instead added it as a feature from the start. Thank God. The link dodge is locked, but it can be bought pretty much straight away if the player has done a little bit of exploring to find some quartz, and can be the first thing upgraded once the P organ is unlocked. The upgrades are a nice touch and give the player more options when build crafting. They can focus on being a powerhouse and staggering enemies quickly, or lean into their consumables if they find they run out of them often. It's neat, and there's no longer anything locked within it that would be deemed as unfair by myself, as well as its rewarding feature for players that try to beat mini-bosses and explore everywhere. They may not get a new weapon or some new fashion, but they can upgrade and strengthen their P. That sounds strange, but it's staying in. The next place the player is taken to is Vanini Works, an industrial factory that has puppets making more puppets. It's got everything you want from a level, a variety of enemies, some mini-bosses, NPCs to interact with, some great weapons, outfits to find, surprise balls of death, jump scare moments with puppets landing on your head or jumping out of a blind spot, oh, and a swamp, everyone's favourite Souls-like gimmick. At this point, you can class a game as being a Souls-like if it has a swamp, it's that much of a staple to the genre. The mini-bosses in this area include a stalker and a puppet known as the Puppet of the Future. This boss is in a pool of acid and the player will die if they stand in it whilst trying to fight, unless they use the right item. Or they can continue on with the level and eventually find a valve that drains it all and the player can fight on a more fair basis. I really love this level as it starts to bring all the bullshit of the Souls-likes into it and the player can start feeling at home again. Jokes aside, I do really enjoy this level, and a lot of it comes down to the world building that is done in this section and with the items that you find throughout. Just before entering the facility, the player can answer a phone and speak with the King of Riddles, a mysterious character that speaks in rhyme and leaves P with a riddle for him to answer. If the player gets it right, they're rewarded with a key for a Trinity room. These rooms are found throughout certain levels, including Vanini Works. They contain some cryptic messages and often either an upgrade part that can be used to increase P's defences or a weapon or outfit. These rooms build on the mystery of the world and a secret organisation that runs it, building a greater thing than what we see in the game, making the player feel small in something much larger. Besides from the rooms, there's also a note from a doctor that confesses his cure he made for the petrification disease did in fact not cure people, but instead mutated them into monsters called carcasses. He sold his cure to dying men, women and children for a quick buck, and in turn aided in his entire city falling to its knees. Again, this just makes the world feel much bigger than what the player sees. There's history to it. The world building is up there for me. Once I dug my head into the lore, I ended up sinking in deep and being buried there until I was able to piece together bits of information and piece together the truth behind crap. The world building is there from beginning to end, always something to find and discover. There's always something in every area that made me stop and think about how this fit into the world, and eventually it all fell together. Vanini Works' somewhat maze-like layout always had me wondering which way I needed to go. The NPCs are unique and the boss that ties it all together is Foco. Unfortunately, one of my least favourite bosses. He is a furnace and oh boy does he know it. His first phase is mostly melee, which is fine and there's not much to know. But his second phase, oh man, well, he starts using a flamethrower if the player is in mid to long range from him, which for the life of me I could not dodge or avoid consistently. You either need to stay close to him at all times or try and get behind him to avoid. When I would run to the side I'd always get caught. It may just be a skill issue, but I guess everyone has that one boss they struggle with and he is mine. He has a move where he takes the floor as lava too seriously and he lights the entire thing on fire. To avoid, you stand behind these pipe things, given that he hasn't knocked them all down by the time he uses the move. Staying in close can be an issue also, as he doesn't like it when he's punished for an attack, so he punishes the punish. This leaves a bad taste in my mouth, since sometimes it feels like a combo is done, you get one attack in and during the attack's animation, he winds up another attack. I can't say how many times I died from this and I always blame myself for being too greedy, but after 4 playthroughs I'm starting to think maybe it's not me. With him being a puppet, he is weak to electric, so that's helpful. Vanini and his butler return to the hotel and from here on the player can use Legion plugs and calipers to make and upgrade Legion arms. There's a good selection to choose from, but the electric and flamethrower arms are seriously good. The two main enemies in the game are weak to these specifically, and so alternating between the two can really aid in combat. However, I urge you to use the others if you haven't. The Aegis shield gives the player a 1-up with its blocking mechanic, and it can be effective at parrying and staggering, and can be the last bit of stagger damage needed to break a boss or an enemy into a vulnerable state. The acid arm is unique in the sense it affects all enemies, but especially those with weapons, and if you're struggling with the end game bosses, I advise you give this a try. The line arm is so much fun when fully upgraded. The combos you can get with this feel so rewarding. Pair this with 2 Dragon Sword, and although it's hard to master, combining the two will leave you feeling like you have won the game. The only arm I think isn't worth your time is the one you start with. But even then, it's useful for getting in some stagger damage, as it can put out a lot of damage with just one hit. Moonlight Town, Path of the Pilgrim and the Cathedral are separate areas within the same level, so I'll put them all under the same umbrella here. With that being said, this is where the player encounters the first carcass, a mutated human turned monster due to the petrification disease. They run at the player and have quick strikes. Much like the puppets, they can be unpredictable, but not because of their bodily makeup, but more because they're acting in instinct, because they aren't in control of themselves. They just lash out with fast attacks. Now that we've seen a carcass for the first time, I want to discuss the enemy variety in the game. From beginning to end, the enemies keep coming and keep changing. Of course, there's your typical puppets and carcasses, but between them, a variety greater than most games, and for the length of which this game goes on, it never slips in design. With the puppets being built to replace jobs and so on for humans, there are an abundance of opportunities in design. There are larger puppets like what we see in the factory, and later on in areas like the Opera House we see smaller childlike puppets, and others that look like they've encountered Sid from Toy Story, as they've been spliced together with arms and legs of other puppets to make spider-like monstrosities. Mini-bosses have some of the most unique designs, with the Jester standing out to me. I love the way it moves and bounces around. Its attacks are almost done in jest rather than with intent, although it's clear which is actually true. The use of the petrification disease again gave the devs a more open field to design creatures and mutants. They weren't locked into a certain design. You want a scorpion type creature with solid armour? Yep, the disease created that. A hulking human with a mustache or a monobrow? Yep, the disease did that too. What about a bear that caught the disease? Yeah, the game has that. There's so many variations that keeps the game feeling new and fresh. Every time I would start a new area, I would assume there would be no new enemies, and a drop off in quality as a whole, but no. Lies of P succeeds where minigame falls off. It continues to give a high quality experience across the entire game, and let me remind you that this was the first time that Round 8 Studios and NeoWiz had made a Soulslike. I'm going on a tangent here, and so let me bring it back round to the point. The enemy design is great, but standard enemies aren't all that's to offer. Bosses and their designs from this point out also become more unique. Within the Cathedral, the end of level boss is the fallen Archbishop, and as the name suggests, he was the one who ran the cathedral. He caught the disease and, well... This is the first carcass boss, and oh, it does not disappoint. The grotesque creature uses its claws, feet, tongue and more as it tries to stop the player. This is the first boss that I fought where I repeatedly died over and over, but I wanted to perfect it. I learned its attacks and timed my parries. I perfected this boss. Eventually I killed it, and I felt that sense of accomplishment that you feel when you've overcame a well designed boss. Wait, what? Yep, that accomplishment feeling was dead and buried after this cutscene, as the realisation of, oh, that was just the first phase, settled in. The boss then turns into one of two fights. You can either fight the one-winged monstrosity, or you can run around him and back to the other side that you fought in phase 1. The fight remains more or less the same, however, he's faster and a bit stronger. With some new attacks where he stands and walks over you before slamming his fat ass onto you, this can be avoided by running away. He does have one move, which still to this day is just bullshit. It's a beam of ergo that he fires at the player, and with not much time to spare, the player must run, otherwise it's instant death. I was killed by this once in my recent playthrough, and yet that was enough for me to know this wasn't a fair attack. If the player decides to fight the new side of the boss, then they will be greeted with large swings, lunges and powerful, less hard to read attacks. I recommend sticking with the back end of the boss as it's easier to learn the attacks rather than learning 2 movesets, and it's also just an easier boss if fought that way. Once defeated, the Archbishop falls yet again and a cutscene plays out showing that a mysterious man is absorbing all the ergo of the bosses we've killed into a machine, and a weapon of sorts is collecting it. This boss is the first of many to have 2 phases. In fact, out of the 15 bosses that aren't optional or stalker fights, there are 7 bosses with 2 phases. And of the 8 remaining, 2 of them are gang fights and 1 of them is a horrendously bad gimmick fight. The amount of 2 phases in this game is unenjoyable because it becomes the norm. You're fighting a boss and then expect a second phase. It's so predictable by the mid game onwards that it shocked me more to encounter a 1 phase fight. As well as having too many 2 phases, some of the boss's fights go on way too long. The King of Puppets is an outstanding fight. However, the first phase is a bit lackluster as opposed to Romeo, where a lot of players will struggle. And so having to slog through the first phase just to learn the second is tedious. Romeo is hard. It requires timing and knowledge of the fight to beat. Having the first phase take so long and drain you of pulse cells and weapon durability and possibly items becomes a chore. It's not rewarding getting to the second phase just to be killed and restart. I think a lot of people would agree that some of the first phases need to lose some health as a quality of life improvement. They did it with Simon Manus and the Fallen Archbishop, and I think they should have done it with the King of Puppets and the Green Monster of the Swamp. Before moving on from the cathedral, it's here where the player meets Alidoro, a treasure hunter who will swap your boss ergo items into either a weapon or an amulet with different beneficial properties. The boss items are usually powerful weapons with the downside of not being able to split apart to form new weapons, and the amulets often coming with very useful abilities such as one that gives the player the ability to dodge through fury attacks. The level design of Lies of P is probably its weakest element. Not so much with how they actually look, feel, or the details within, but actually how they all come to link with one another. The first few levels all make sense with how they're placed, but after the cathedral it starts to slip and some questionable decisions were made. It's as if they wanted to give you that oh wow feeling when you link back to an old area from a new, however it just doesn't make sense. The first example is after the next area, the Malum district. The district is supposed to be the slums, the civilization of the poor in Krat. It's the first rendition of it, a city before the fame and wealth. After the boss fight there is a building and within it an elevator. Going up this elevator leads to a garden with the mythical golden coin tree, but beyond that is a familiar looking hallway. Going down it leads to a dead end before the wall opens up and it's the hotel. This moment is not a moment of oh shit this links back to here. It doesn't have the player thinking of a map in their head. No, instead it's what the fuck houses brought me here, especially considering the story. A man you can meet named Giangio is looking for this tree. Its fruit bears medicinal properties and if used by the right person it could potentially be turned to a cure for diseases, including the petrification disease. This man finds it before the player does despite it being behind an elevator behind a group of stalkers. Stalkers known as the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, a group turned bad as they now rob and kill for their own survival and help out the alchemists by completing jobs for them. So this group of bandits that just tried to kill P are literally an elevator away from not only the hotel but a tree with medicinal properties that hold a great amount of value. And yet they're working with the evil guys to get money to escape the city. The only piece of plot armor is in a document that states they don't want to attack the people of the hotel. However, they've clearly been into the hotel before since they stole the painting from Geppetto, but even then the tree that could make them wealthy is outside of it. When P meets Giangio again, he says he can't pick the fruit due to having the disease himself, so unless all members of the Brotherhood have it, I don't see why they can't use it themselves. This decision of having the district connect to the hotel not only causes a plot hole for the story, but within the level design. They could have easily made it attached to another area, or even the same area but have it linked in a way that doesn't implicate the Brotherhood. This is not the only time the game links areas for the sake of it. There's 2 more I can think of, the first being the connection between the hotel and the relic of Trismegistus, which is a ravine where Ergo in its physical form Crowd was found. It doesn't surprise me that there's some link between the ravine and the hotel, but more how it's executed. At a point in the story we need to get down there in order to travel to an island off the coast of Krat, and a form of transport can be found at the bottom. However, the entrance is shut off and only able to open from the other side, according to Antonia. Later on the hotel is attacked and Antonia gives P a tune to play on the piano. This opens a secret door leading to an elevator where P can finally descend into the ravine. Why is she only allowing us to open it after the attack? This just seems like a case of holding a secret for the sake of it until it's the right moment to reveal it. I did see a Reddit post suggesting that the elevator was locked and could only be used if someone used it from the bottom coming upwards, much like all the elevators we find across the city, needing to be activated from one side before it can be used both ways. This is plausible, but it isn't outright said in the game. The last connection that I don't have an explanation for is the connection between the swamp, which is literally landfill for useless puppets, and how it connects to the train station, in a very short walking distance. It's clearly connected to Vanini Works, shown by the one hallway you go through with the similar sound of the alarm going off. As well as that, there's a swampish area at the factory. And it makes sense that the place where the puppets are mass produced would have somewhere nearby to dispose of broken or faulty ones. But how does it link to the train station? We start at the station, come out the crack, go through the city into the factory, and we somehow end up going around in a large circle. With only one hallway of the factory being present to show the player that this swamp is connected to the factory. It's just straight up bad design. It's clearly here to prevent the player from having to use a stargazer to fast travel, or to backtrack to a previous area, but this doesn't make sense, and in future games is the only aspect that I truly believe the devs need to work on. Clearly they're trying to make a map like Dark Souls 1 where a lot of it links back and it's a wow moment, a factor that makes the players stop and think, and yet here it seems to be used as a method of just moving the player on to the next place. It's a shame as the actual levels tend to be great in quality. I enjoyed all levels up until the very last, the Abbey. The Abbey is a large tower which P must ascend. It goes on for way too long. Stairs that go up for what feels like a lifetime. There's a section in the middle which acts as a prison area and it makes sense with the story, but the density of enemies and that of which reside within ruin it for me. There's multiple repeated mini bosses that you have to kill to activate levers and whatnot to move on, and although I like the challenge, this isn't a fun one. It was tedious, resulting in me just trying to speedrun my way through this whole area. As well as how it's mapped out, the levels are also mandatory, and although I don't have an issue with this, I found myself being disappointed with the lack of optional and secret areas to discover. That sense of wonder and exploration was never met in this game, and it's fine that they chose to do that, but if they are, then commit to it. Instead, there is one optional area, that being the Hermit's Cave. And there's no boss, just a mini-boss, and the area itself is lackluster. Either add more optional areas instead of just one, or none at all. I would be bothered by the lack of exploration more, however the game does have so much content that asking for more feels wrong, especially given that this game also doesn't charge £70 here in the UK, giving a solid 30 hours minimum of game for less than the industry standard. But this is a critique and not a review, and so I would like to see them make more secret areas in future. And DLC has been announced, so it's possible they will add extra areas within the DLC. The level design is the weakest aspect of this game, however I do believe that the details hidden within the levels and atmosphere that is set for each is truly a masterpiece. Lies of P has a lot of horror built into it, not by genre but by setting. Starting with the first area, there are bloody beaten corpses surrounding the area you wake up. As you move further into Central Station, you can see a large puppet repeatedly pummeling the corpse of a dead woman. Surrounding him are more just like her. Although she is very unalive, the puppet continues to beat and beat and beat, almost as if it's being told to do that, like it's programmed to do it and just that. The horror continues, and shortly after the station in Elysian Boulevard, the player can find what looks to be a monster conjoined with the wall. Upon closer inspection, you'll find it's no monster, it's a human. A human that caught and died due to the petrification disease. And just as the name implies, they did petrify, moulding into the wall they once slumped against to rest. Their limbs disconnected themselves and sprouted out like a branch from a tree. This continues across the game to the bitter end, however showing and talking about them now would be a disservice without the context of the story. So without further ado, allow me to go through the biggest story beats and explain the rest of the plot. P fights his way through puppets and monster carcasses up to the Opera House, aka the Rosa Estate, located on Rosa Isabel Street, to take on the King of Puppets, who, as the name suggests, leads the puppets. Geppetto believes that the puppet frenzy is his doing, and he needs to be stopped. Vanini has given P an ergo wavelength decoder at this point to try and understand what the puppets are saying to each other as they speak in a cryptic way. P encounters the king, but before the fight a theatrical play is shown to him. It shows a man resembling Geppetto taking the P organ out of a puppet resembling P and putting it into another one. Afterwards, the king puts out his hand in an offer of a truce, but P slaps that shit away and instead wants to fight. It's revealed that underneath the mechanical mass is the puppet of a boy named Romeo. After the kill, P takes a necklace that Romeo dropped to Sophia, where she explains that P and Romeo seem to have once known each other, and at this point P's hair grows, symbolising his growth towards humanity. P moves on and eventually reaches the Grand Exhibition, a museum-esque building which had planned to showcase future puppets and revolutionise Krat even further. At the end of the exhibition, P encounters Champion Victor, a sportsman entertainer who died and has been brought back by the alchemists. After the fight, we meet the man from the cutscene earlier on. His name is Simon Manus, the leader of the alchemists. He explains how the group have been experimenting on people and creatures in order to fulfill their ultimate goal, immortality. In order to complete their goals, they looked into the petrification disease further and found something rather unsettling. The petrification disease was the process of a person's soul manifesting and becoming a physical thing. When they died, they weren't truly dead. They were just corpses, but their soul, their ergo, would live on past them. The ergo that powers P is the souls of others. That is why when puppets were powered by ergo, they started showing signs of enlightenment. Their personality would come back and take over, overwriting the Grand Covenant. Simon would need this ergo as a fuel source in order to fuel his machine he was using to power the relic. Their goals were to reach immortality, but Simon wanted to also become a god, and in order to exact this plan, he was the one who released the petrification disease among the citizens of an innocent city, killing and harvesting people. With that information, P decides to take on the problem and confront it at the source, at the alchemist's lair of the Isle of Alchemists. Before departing, Vanini has cracked the decoder, and on it is a message that he needs P to listen to. It's Romeo who explains that him and all puppets were controlled by the Grand Covenant Rule 1, and a secret Rule 0. Rule 1, obey your creator's command. Rule 0, the creator is Giuseppe Geppetto. That's right, the maker of the puppets instilled a hidden Law 0, and it was in fact his word that began the puppet frenzy, and Romeo was trying to show P his master plan in the play. At this point, P wants to confront Geppetto, but he is being kidnapped by stalkers and taken to the Isle. P heads to the Isle and confronts Simon, who has grafted the limbs of others as well as the arm of God onto himself, and he becomes an awakened god. After defeating him, P finds Geppetto, who gives him a choice: hand over his P organ, his heart, and be turned into a real boy, or refuse and he will have to forcefully remove it from his chest. The reason for this betrayal is Geppetto lost his son, Carlo, the boy that P is modelled after. He created P to task him with things that would cause him to gain ergo and awaken his own that was used to power him. When awakened, he would then give up his heart, containing the memory, soul and personality of Carlo, and place it back into his son's deceased body, in an attempt to bring him back to life through soul and blood, having him back in his original body. If P refuses, Geppetto controls the limp body of Carlo and the two must battle to the death. Now that I've summed up the story, I can explain details across the levels with a better context. If you're interested in hearing more about the story, I have a video covering its entirety including all the NPC's individual stories. Check it out if you're interested. The horror that Krat has endured is shown in its streets and its victims as the player moves through it. Notes and documents can be found demonstrating this. Bloody letters and details of people who were just trying to find a way out. The multiple quarantine zones you can find with notes on the door saying that the people within are decaying while still alive. Their brain is dying and they're going insane. No one is to listen to them. There's a very sickening note from a mother written to the god she believes in, asking for him to take the pain away from her small child and instead inflict it onto her. The child has done no wrong in its life and yet it caught this disease, slowly turning to stone or even worse. In the final area, the Abbey, we can find the body of someone who was killed during an experiment. Despite the death of one of their own, the alchemists saw this death as a sacrifice for the greater good. It's almost a cult-like behaviour. Of course, there's the swamp, which is, as Gemini states, a graveyard, except this one is teeming with life left to die. Puppets once not good enough or faulty were sent there and, well, now they roam through piles of their own, with no escape. The enemy designs lean into the crazed city as we know it. Obviously the Archbishop is one of the more disturbing ones, as well as the green monster of the swamp. It's the way this disease is almost parasitic in the way that it controls its prey, and uses their bodies as a conflux for destruction and death. Horror is subjective, sure, but the idea of something you once trusted turning and massacring you in your city is horrifying. Even more so when it's paired with a plague that's petrifying those unlucky enough to breathe it in. What I love is how throughout the entire game we see the mental and physical decline of humans due to the frenzy and the epidemic, mainly the latter, as their minds abate and their bodies become vessels of a lifeless soul. Meanwhile we see the awakening of puppets. It's funny how the two events run parallel to one another and yet, rather oxymoronically, the two are opposite circumstances, with humans losing control of themselves and puppets finding and taking control. We see the decline in the obvious quarantine zone with NPCs such as the weeping woman who believes a doll is her baby. We see some stalkers who aren't losing their will through a disease but instead their sanity through trauma. There's one at Vanini Works who failed to help his friend live and tried to repent by slaughtering as many puppets as he could, but it never worked. There's my favourite stalker in the game, the Owl Doctor, whose sanity has been broken to the point he forgot his own name and kills people whilst they're still human to save them from a more tragic fate of becoming a carcass. In typical Souls fashion, the story and setting of the game is bleak, with characters often not meeting a happy end. I don't have a problem with how the story was approached, but I do have some gripes with the overall decision making of the game and the result of that. There are multiple endings, with one being referred to as the true ending, one a very clear bad ending, and another which I often refer to as the good-ish ending. But it's honestly hard to say what it is except for a cop-out for going between decisions rather than sticking to one or another. What I mean by this is if the player dedicates themselves to a lie playthrough, then they will get a true ending, which shows P becoming a real boy in the sense that his ego has awoken and he understands humanity, developing emotions and a personality, whereas at the start, despite not being tied to the Grand Covenant, he would follow orders like a mindless puppet, despite the orders given. He also fights and kills a nameless puppet who also just killed Geppetto, and as he is dying in P's arms, P sheds a tear demonstrating that he has become human. Geppetto recognises his mistakes. His son was there. If only he hadn't tried to bond him back to his body, everything could have been what he wanted. The following scene shows P putting Sophia's ergo into a puppet of her and bringing her back to life. This is a unique scene to the true ending. The bad ending, and my personal favourite, is rewarded for playing a truth orientated playthrough, and by the end P has gained no humanity. He is a puppet, a mindless one that responds to the pulls of the strings that Geppetto guides. P hands over his heart, giving himself up. Carlo is then brought back from the dead and in a new body, and with a smile on his face, he massacres all those in the hotel because Geppetto asked him to. Everyone is then replaced by puppets and Geppetto sets off to clean up the rest of Krat to make it a safer place for both of them. Despite being told he would become a real boy, in only flesh he is real, as in mind he is controlled by Geppetto. I like this ending because it's so unlike the others. The brutal ending to the people that helped us along the way, killed at our hands, all for the one that caused the city's demise, and all despite the fact that Carlo is human. The final, goodish ending is what you get when you lie in some circumstances and tell truths in others. There's two main choices in the game that have a large factor of the ending: letting Sophia die or live, and giving up the heart to Geppetto. For the ending, keeping Sophia alive and fighting the nameless puppet are the choices needed. As well as that, a low humanity needs to be achieved by not always lying. This is the most disappointing ending in my opinion. It's the exact same as the true one, but P does not shed a tear and Geppetto calls him a pathetic puppet. There's no other scene of Sophia or anything, just the post-credit scene which is shown no matter the ending. I wish this one was just a bit more unique. The scene of Geppetto dying can stay as it demonstrates the butterfly effect of how things can change due to our actions, but a scene afterwards just to make it stand out as its own ending, even something small, I think would have been better. The order in which you get these endings may change your perception, and I think if I'd gotten this ending first, then either of the other two, I think it would have been seen as a better conclusion, and then the true ending would just be building off of that. But I got the true, then the bad, then the goodish ending, and I just didn't feel it was a good ending compared to the others. As mentioned, there is a post-credit scene, which no matter the ending is played. The scene shows an NPC who is believed to be called Giangio. He has been lying to the player the whole time. His name is Paracelsus, a reference to the real-life alchemist Philippus Paracelsus. He and the group he is a part of, the Immortals, have orchestrated the entire game in order to find a new form of immortality. The scene also sets up the sequel when Paracelsus says his next key is Dorothy, before it cuts to the Dorothy from Wizard of Oz skipping across Krat's buildings. It's a great final scene and certainly got me hyped for a sequel. This could also imply that the title of the game is actually Lies of Paracelsus, not Lies of Pinocchio. The music? Yeah, it slaps. There's not only the music from the levels and bosses, cutscenes, whatnot, but also the records, and the music on these are some of the best in the game. Feel and Quintoxic are some of my favourite tracks from the entire OST, and I listen to them on Spotify all the time. They add a layer to the game since a large part of Krat is the fact that humans have the puppets to do the mundane things and tasks that they would normally do. Now that they have a way around that, they dedicate a lot of time to entertainment, including singing, operas, and so these recordings to me show that it's all true, again adding to the history of the world that we're in. The iconic sound of the bosses came from Yi Kun Yu, and he did not disappoint. I love how he makes the sounds of each boss and how they escalate in tension during the fight. One of my favourites is the Mad Donkey, and another one is Wings of Hypocrisy, the music to the Fallen Archbishop. I didn't cover all the bosses, and so here I'm going to talk about my least and most favourite. If it was a tier list, since that seems to be a popular thing, it would look like this. The endgame includes some of the best bosses in the entire game. Laxasia is a beast. She demands perfection from the player, and it's the only boss in the game where I had to put it down and come back the next day to finish it. She is seriously tough, for all the right reasons. Simon is a good fight. His attacks in the first phase can have some questionable hitboxes at times, but I think that dodging and positioning is your best friend here, and once beaten can be done fairly easily. His second phase was an incredibly epic conclusion to the story, with him being assisted by the gods, and the arena was great too. The magic can be annoying, but I don't think I ever died to it. It was normally some combo or the fury attack or him jumping in the air and slamming down. I will say some of his attacks come off screen, and that can be an issue sometimes. Sometimes you have to kind of predict when he's gonna land an attack, which can be really jarring for when you're trying to perfect a parry. Romeo is a really hard but fun fight, and I like the fact he doesn't have a ton of health. His attacks can seem daunting, but if you wanted to, you can dash to the left of his attacks and successfully dodge them. However, his fire combo is a game changer for me. Sometimes he would do it and I would be screwed, others he just wouldn't do it at all. That is a hard combo to learn, and if you're struggling, I suggest the dodge to the left technique and run when he does the fire combo. But my favourite fight of them all has got to be the Nameless Puppet. Besides the basic yet horrific design and the story behind him, he is such a good conclusion to the game and a challenge for those who want more than Simon. He is the accumulation of what the players have learned, the ultimate skill check. Players must be patient with his attacks, they must learn to parry, must know when to dodge and when to attack. His first phase isn't too long and left me feeling accomplished when I was able to parry and successfully counter his entire phase. The second of which is much harder, with a resemblance to the Lady Maria fight in the Bloodborne DLC. He swings faster, much faster actually, to the point where they added a cue for when to parry on some attacks. And he takes the combo lengths from Laxasia and pisses all over them. He is truly a great fight. If you have not played the game, I urge you to try and learn his attacks. Perfect this fight, as to me it's the best one in the game and is the most rewarding. But where there's good there's bad, and the last of the bosses in the last area is the Dark Guardian. Holy shit, this guy sucks. He's a gimmick fight. He needs to be slapped across the ankle or parried until you're able to stagger and perform a heavy attack. Once he stumbles over, you can deal massive damage with a fatal attack. This fight is so boring and tedious, but as well as being boring, he's also very annoying. You would assume that it's because he needs to be staggered before being able to do any real damage, and you'd be right, but as well as this, if he lands any attacks, he inflicts a shock status, and not electric shock, no, shock as in the 1,000-yard stare shock, that PTSD shock. It causes P to gain stamina incredibly slow, and can completely ruin the fight for you. It also fills up rather quick due to how hard the Guardian hits. Absolutely the worst boss in the game, hands down. I don't mind the gimmick, but paired with how long it takes to stagger, plus the downside of inflicting shock, it leads to the most miserable fight in the game. The Black Rabbit Brotherhood fights, yes, plural, deserve a mention. They are gang fights. The first one is fine. The eldest sibling leads the fight and the siblings will jump in, do their part and dip. Luckily, when the younger siblings do join in, they come alone, and so you're fighting 2 maximum. And the eldest takes a step back and stops being so aggressive, giving the player time to focus on the younger sibling. Overall, it's not that bad. The eldest weapon can be broke, and I really suggest doing this if you can, since it reduces the damage you take. He has some attacks where he goes to slam and do a heavy swing and it locks onto P like a military grade missile. You can move behind him and he'll do a full U-turn midair and hit you when he never should have, but besides that, not much to note. The second fight is harder. You face the 3 young ones at the same time, with each one of them inflicting a certain status. Lucky enough though, you can aggro one of them and focus until they're dead. However, they do tend to swap around. You can backstab them fairly easily with them being human, so look for attacks that allow you to move around and backstab in time before their next attack. Once 2 of them are down and the third is half health, the newly resurrected eldest brother will spawn and he aggros on you the whole time. He has short and long range attacks now. The The arena is built in a way that allows you to gain some distance and also take cover behind objects. The first time I ever did this fight, I managed to beat him. I don't know how, since every time afterwards on New Game and New Game Plus, I have never beaten them within 5 tries, in fact probably 10. The green monster I want to mention purely because I love the concept of it, a creature of unknown origin that feasts on the ergo of puppets, and this cutscene of it taking control of a watchman is probably one of my favourite boss cutscenes in the game. The stalkers all kind of feel the same to me. They're all hard but can be cheesed by backstabbing them, and I wouldn't class them as real bosses. I do want to mention, whilst on the topic of bosses, that for some reason the Walker of Illusions, the corrupted Parade Master and the Nameless Puppet cannot have a summon brought into the fight. Especially with the last two, I don't get why the devs did this. Summons are a gameplay mechanic. Some people enjoy using them, others don't. I personally don't like using them when trying to beat a boss for the first time, yet some players may find it too difficult and may be forced to give up on some fights if it wasn't an option. It is in this game, and yet they removed it for some of the fights, including the Nameless Puppet that I'd argue is one of the hardest. I'm not sure if they did this for a lore or a story reason, but really I don't think that it was the right choice to make. I mean, the Parade Master has a summon in the first time you fight it, so why not the second time? It doesn't make sense to me, and it's a good way to force people to have to give up. You could say get good, and that's true, but not everyone enjoys Souls games the same way. As mentioned, summons are a gameplay mechanic, not a cheat, just a different way to play the game should a player want to or choose to. Removing that for seemingly no reason makes no sense, either have it for all fights or none. The last thing I want to talk about is replayability. There's obviously the endings to achieve and aim for, as well as that there's all the bosses to beat, and since the boss ergo gives the player a choice between a weapon and an amulet, it may be an incentive to run the game again and get all the things you didn't on your first or second run, including different garbs and hats. I don't often replay games, I'm just not the type to rerun a game multiple times, especially not back to back, yet this game got me hooked, and I played it 3 times back to back and once more for this video. There's a ton of weapons to try out, and even more if you make them yourself. You can try different builds together, and if you play New Game Plus, you can respec with the Saintess of Mercy statue, making a new build right from the word go. There's NPC quests that you can choose differently, although the outcome may not be much different. There's challenge runs to try out, there's so much replayability here. I honestly suggest that if you have not played this and are a fan of the Soulslikes, that you play it. I urge you to give it a go. Despite having a strong difficulty curve, this game and the devs who made it know what it means to be a Souls-like. They get it, and it's remarkable that this was their first game of its kind. Every aspect of it is fantastic. The cons I have with the game seem like many, but in truth are outweighed by the greatness this game beholds. In future games, I could only say that I hope for the level design to improve. Maybe bosses can be more balanced with a few less two-faced ones, but that is about it. It's incredible that this game is the closest to FromSoft quality, and it was the first attempt at it. So with the DLC and a sequel in the works, I can only see this franchise becoming bigger and better. Some good competition to FromSoft, and with that, Lies of P is a masterpiece.